Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we'll uncover a terrifying twist. Uri finally finds Mrs. Ngia safe, but a stranger sends a photo of the hiding place, proving they've been watched the whole time. Who is behind Lin, and what happens when Mr. Tuan calls her and she agrees to meet? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. Uri didn't let panic take the room. He felt it try. The instant Tu Tieu showed him the photo on her phone. Aunt Mai's white gate, the blue flowers, a clean, sharp image taken from the street in the same cold morning light. Proof they weren't only being threatened, they were being watched. But Uri didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table. He didn't let fear turn into chaos. He stepped closer to his mother and lowered his voice until it sounded like warmth. "Mum," he said gently, "look at me. You're safe. We're going to move you, quietly, and we're going to do it smart." Mrs. Ngia's eyes were wide, her breath shallow. Her fingers held onto Uri's sleeve as if letting go would make her disappear again. Tu Tieu wiped her cheeks, forcing herself to breathe. "They know this address," she whispered. "We can't stay." Aunt Mai's jaw tightened. "I knew it. I felt it." Uri nodded respectfully toward Mai. "Aunt Mai, thank you," he said. "You protected her when she had nowhere else to go." Mai's eyes softened for half a second. "Then don't waste time." Uri turned to Tu Tieu, calm but decisive. "2 cars," he said. "2 routes." Tu Tieu understood immediately. Decoy and real. Uri nodded. "You take the burner phone and leave first. Drive normally. No sudden turns. Make it look like you're leaving with Mom." Tu Tieu's face went pale. "Uri?" He reached for her hand, steady and gentle. "I'm not putting you in danger. You'll stay in public areas, cameras, people. If anything feels wrong, you go straight to a crowded place and call me." Tu Tieu swallowed hard, then nodded. "Okay." Uri looked back at his mother. "Mum, you'll come with me. We're going to move you somewhere safe. Somewhere with a front desk, cameras, witnesses. A place where no one can quietly corner you." Mrs. Ngia's voice trembled. "What if they follow you?" Uri brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "If they follow, we'll know. And if we know, we can outsmart them." Aunt Mai hurried to the window and peeked through the curtain. "There's a dark car down the street," she murmured. "It's been there too long." Tu Tieu's stomach dropped. "The same car as before?" "Could be," Mai said. Uri stayed calm. "That's fine," he said softly. "Let them think they're winning." He guided Mrs. Ngia to the back room and helped her put on the coat Mai had given her. His hands moved carefully, button by button, like he was trying to stitch courage back into her. "Mum," he whispered, "I'm sorry you ever had to be afraid." Mrs. Ngia's lips trembled. "I didn't want you dragged into this." Uri looked at her with a tenderness that didn't waver. "You didn't drag me," he said quietly. "You're my mother. Being here is love." Tu Tieu stood in the doorway watching. Even in crisis, Uri was gentle. Even under pressure, his voice never sharpened. His strength wasn't loud, it was steady. Uri glanced at Tu Tieu and gave a small, reassuring smile, as if to say, "We're okay. We're together." Then he picked up Tu Tieu's phone, dimmed the brightness, and turned off anything that could betray location. "First," he murmured, "we stop feeding them information." He wrapped a scarf around Mrs. Ngia's hair, not to hide her, but to make her less recognizable at a glance. Then he looked at Tu Tieu. "Ready?" Tu Tieu took the burner phone and nodded. "I'll go." Aunt Mai opened the gate just enough for Tu Tieu to slip out. Tu Tieu walked to her car calmly, like any ordinary morning. Her hands were shaking, but her steps were controlled. She got in, started the engine, and drove away slowly. Uri counted under his breath. 10 seconds, watching through the curtain. Down the street, the dark car shifted, like a predator waking up. Uri exhaled. "They're biting." Now he moved. Uri guided Mrs. Ngia out the back door and along a side path, then into his car parked behind the house, hidden from the street. Aunt Mai pressed a small bag into his hand. "Water, snacks, her medicine," Mai said. "And Uri looked at her. Yes? Mai's eyes were fierce. Bring her back safe. Yuri nodded, sincere. I will. He drove away quietly, taking the long route through busier streets. He didn't go straight to a destination. He looped. He tested the road. He watched the mirrors. He made turns where cameras were likely to exist, and he stayed where other cars were near. At the second red light, he checked the mirror. No dark car. At the third turn, he checked again. Still clear. His phone buzzed once. Tu Tieu. A car followed me for 2 blocks, then turned off. I'm safe. Yuri felt his chest loosen by a single inch. Good. The decoy had pulled attention, even briefly. He glanced at his mother in the passenger seat. Mrs. Ngia stared out the window like she was afraid the world might recognize her. Yuri reached over and rested his hand gently on hers. You're doing well, he said softly. Mrs. Ngia's eyes filled. Yuri, I'm so tired. I know, he whispered. Rest your head. I've got you. He brought her to a modest hotel on a busy street. Bright lobby, cameras at the entrance, staff at the desk, people moving in and out. Safety through visibility. Yuri checked in under a different name, paid in advance, requested a room away from the elevator. He didn't smile much, but he stayed polite. Calm politeness made people remember you in a good way, and right now, being remembered could become a shield. Inside the room, he locked the door, pulled the curtains, and sat beside his mother on the edge of the bed. This is temporary, he said gently. A safe pause. Mrs. Ngia looked at him like she couldn't decide whether to cry or breathe. I never wanted you to see me like this. Yuri took her hands again, both of them. I want to see you, he said softly. I want you alive. Everything else can be repaired. A knock came a little later. Yuri looked through the peephole first. Tu Tieu. He opened the door quickly and pulled her inside. The moment Tu Tieu saw Mrs. Ngia sitting safely on the bed, her face crumpled with relief. She stepped forward slowly, as if afraid the scene would break. Mrs. Ngia, Tu Tieu whispered. Mrs. Ngia reached out. Tu Tieu took her hand and bowed her head for a second, overwhelmed. I'm sorry, she said softly. I was terrified. Mrs. Ngia shook her head. You tried. Thank you. Yuri watched them, gratitude tightening his chest. Then he stood, looked at Tu Tieu with quiet purpose, and spoke like someone who already knew the next move. Now we go to Mr. Tuan, he said. Tu Tieu's eyes sharpened. Today? Now, Yuri replied gently, before he hides more. Mrs. Ngia sat up, alarmed. Yuri, don't trust him. Yuri knelt in front of her so his voice could feel close, not commanding. I won't trust him with my heart, he promised. But I'll use him for information, and I won't go alone. Tu Tieu will be with me. Tu Tieu nodded. We keep it clean, legal, no threats. Yuri turned back to his mother. If we do nothing, they keep control. If we move smart, we take it back. Mrs. Ngia's lips trembled, but she nodded. Be careful. Yuri kissed her forehead softly. Always. He stood, and before leaving he set clear rules. If anyone knocks, you don't open. You call me. If you feel unsafe, you call the front desk and ask them to come to the door. Mrs. Ngia nodded, clinging to his instructions like lifelines. Yuri and Tu Tieu stepped into the hallway together, and Yuri's hand found Tu Tieu's for a brief moment. Warm, steady. You okay? He asked softly. Tu Tieu nodded, eyes wet. I'm okay, 'cause you're steady. Yuri gave her a small smile. We'll stay steady together. They walked out into the cold daylight and drove toward Mr. Tuan's office. 2 calm hearts holding back a storm. Mr. Tuan's building looked exactly the same as before. Grey, quiet, too ordinary for the kind of damage it held inside. Yuri parked without rushing, then turned to Tu Tieu. We go in calm, he said gently. We don't give fear a show. Tu Tieu nodded. We ask for documents. We stay professional. Yuri's gaze softened. Thank you for being with me. Tu Tieu's voice was small but firm. Always. Inside, the office smelled like old paper and weak coffee. Mr. Tuan looked up from his desk and the colour drained from his face the moment he saw Uri. Uri? Uri didn't glare. He didn't slam his hand on the desk. He walked forward slowly and placed his phone on the table, face up, like a quiet reminder that truth lasts longer than excuses. "My mother disappeared," Uri said gently, "and I know you know more than you told us." Mr. Tuan swallowed. "I told Tu Tieu what I could." Tu Tieu stepped forward, calm but firm. "No, you told me what was convenient." Mr. Tuan's hands trembled as he reached for a pen, then stopped. "You don't understand. If authorities get involved..." Uri's voice stayed soft. "Then your past comes out." Mr. Tuan flinched. Uri leaned in slightly, still gentle. "I'm not here to ruin you," he said. "But you need to understand something. Lin won't protect you." Mr. Tuan blinked. "What?" Tu Tieu's tone remained steady. "If Lin gets cornered, she'll blame someone, and you're the easiest person to blame." Mr. Tuan stared at the desk, breathing hard. The office suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were moving inward. Uri continued, voice warm but unbreakable. "Help us do this the right way. Give us the documents. Give us the truth, and we can stop this before it destroys more lives." Mr. Tuan's eyes flicked between them, panic and calculation fighting inside him. "What documents?" "Transfer records," Tu Tieu said immediately. "Investment agreements. The accounts Lin used. Withdrawal logs. Anything." Mr. Tuan's jaw tightened. "Those records could implicate me." Uri nodded slowly, compassionate but firm. "Silence already implicates you." That landed. Mr. Tuan opened a drawer with shaking hands and pulled out a thin folder. He slid it across the desk like it was poison. Tu Tieu opened it carefully. Receipts, signatures, a bank account number, and printed log showing repeated cash withdrawals. Tu Tieu's finger moved down the page and stopped. "These withdrawals repeat," she whispered. "Same ATM, same area." Uri leaned closer. "A pattern." Mr. Tuan looked sick. "I didn't want to know." Tu Tieu looked up. "But you did know." Mr. Tuan's voice cracked. "I suspected." Uri didn't punish him with harsh words. He simply said, "Then help us finish this." Tu Tieu flipped another page and froze. "There's a second name here," she said quietly. Uri leaned in. Not Lin's name. Another signature. An intermediary authorizing transfers. Someone standing between Lin and the money trail. Mr. Tuan's face went grey. That name shouldn't be there. Uri's gaze lifted, calm and clear. That's the person behind her. Tu Tieu's pulse quickened. "If we build a legal trap around this, Lin will surface." Mr. Tuan recoiled. "If you do that," Uri interrupted softly. "If we do nothing, they keep hunting my mother." Mr. Tuan's shoulders sagged. "What do you want from me?" Tu Tieu answered cleanly. "Cooperation, records, a statement, and one more thing." Mr. Tuan blinked. "What?" Uri met his eyes. "Call Lin." "Mr." Tuan jerked back. "No." Uri's tone stayed gentle. "Not to threaten her. To make her believe you're panicking, that the records are about to surface." Tu Tieu added, "If she thinks the trail is exposed, she'll move. Running people make mistakes." Mr. Tuan's mouth opened, then closed. Fear sat on him like weight. "She'll run," he whispered. Uri nodded. "Good. Let her run toward a wall." Mr. Tuan stared at Uri as if searching for anger, because anger would be easier to fight. But Uri's steadiness was harder. It didn't crack. It didn't bend. Finally, Mr. Tuan nodded, defeated. "I'll do it." Tu Tieu's phone buzzed. A message from the hotel. Someone asked about Mrs. Nghia at the front desk. Tu Tieu's blood ran cold. She showed Uri. Uri's expression softened. Not fear, but urgency wrapped in calm. "They're faster than we thought." He looked back at Mr. Tuan, voice steady. "Call her, now." Mr. Tuan's fingers shook as he unlocked his phone. He hesitated, then pressed dial. Ring. Ring. Tu Tieu held her breath. Uri's eyes stayed on Mr. Tuan's face, watching every reaction like it mattered. Because it did. A click. A voice answered. Light, guarded, almost bored. Mr. Tuan forced a shaky tone. Lynn, it's me. A pause. What do you want? Lynn's voice came through, careful. Mr. Tuan swallowed loudly, acting terrified. It's happening. People are asking questions. There are documents, bank records. Your name is on too many pages. Ly Tu Tieu exchanged a quick glance. Good. Keep going. Lynn's voice sharpened. You said you would handle it. I can't, Mr. Tuan whispered. They're coming. If you don't fix this, I'm ruined. Lynn went quiet for a beat. Then she spoke slower. Where are you? Mr. Tuan glanced at Ly. Ly gave the smallest nod. Don't say a place. Make her choose. Mr. Tuan shook his head like a man on the edge. I can't talk here. I can't. Lynn cut in, colder now. Listen, if you're really panicking, meet me. 1 hour. Don't bring anyone and don't try anything stupid. Tu Tieu's heart slammed. Ly stayed calm, eyes steady. He leaned slightly forward, listening like every syllable could lead to Mrs. Nhia's safety. Mr. Tuan's voice trembled. Where? Lynn named a location, a place that sounded public enough to feel safe, but quiet enough to control. A parking area near a shopping strip early afternoon when people are around but not too attentive. Uri's mind moved fast without showing it. Lynn continued, warning, If I see a shadow behind you, this ends, and don't forget, you owe me. The call ended. Mr. Tuan dropped the phone like it burned. Tu Tieu exhaled shakily. She took the bait. Ly nodded, calm and focused. Now we do this legally and carefully. Mr. Tuan looked sick. You're going to set her up. Uri's voice stayed gentle. We're going to stop her. There's a difference. Tu Tieu opened her notes, already planning. We inform legal counsel. We gather these documents. We don't touch her. We let her incriminate herself. Ly picked up the folder, careful, and slid it into a bag. And we secure my mother. Tu Tieu's phone buzzed again. Another message from the hotel. The person asked again. They described her scarf. Tu Tieu's hands went cold. Uri's eyes softened with protective urgency. They're close. He stood. We go back to the hotel now. We relocate her again. Then we proceed with the meet. Tu Tieu nodded immediately. 2 routes again. Ly looked at Mr. Tuan. You stay available. If Lynn calls back, you answer. Short, calm, no details. Mr. Tuan swallowed. Ly, I'm sorry. Uri's voice was quiet. Help us make it right. They walked out fast, still calm but faster. Outside, Ly dialed the hotel and spoke politely, firmly, like someone who understood systems. This is her family, he said. No information, no room number. If anyone asks again, note the description and call me. He hung up and turned to Tu Tieu, warmth still in his eyes even as the danger closed in. We found her once, he said softly. We'll keep finding her, every time. Tu Tieu nodded, tears brimming. And this time, we don't just survive. We take control back. Uri's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He didn't answer yet. He looked at Tu Tieu, then at the road ahead. Calm, steady, protective. Whatever this is, Ly murmured, we face it together. Ly and Tu Tieu discover they're being watched when an unknown number sends a photo of Aunt Mai's gate, forcing them to move Mrs. Nhia in secret. Ly stays calm and protective, using a 2-car decoy plan to relocate his mother to a busy hotel with cameras and staff. Once she's safe, Ly and Tu Tieu confront Mr. Tuan and pressure him to hand over financial records tied to Lynn's theft. In the documents, they spot a suspicious pattern of cash withdrawals and a second name acting as an intermediary, proof Lynn didn't act alone. To trigger a mistake, they convince Mr. Tuan to call Lynn and pretend the bank records are about to be exposed. Lynn takes the bait, warns him not to bring anyone, and agrees to meet at a public location. But the danger closes in again when someone questions the hotel staff about Mrs. Nhia, suggesting the enemy's already nearby.